Hi, I'm Chris Moore, and this is Daniel Obrist, and we're part of the Division of Atmospheric Sciences at the Desert Research Institute in Reno, Nevada. We're here to talk a little bit about a paper that we published recently in the journal Nature. In this paper, we show how changes in Arctic sea ice can actually impact mercury and ozone concentrations in the atmosphere. This is a topic that's very near and dear to us because we run the Environmental Mercury Lab here at DRI. And the main focus of our research is on the cycling of pollutants through every compartment of the environment. In particular, we look at air, soil, snow, and ice.
Now, as many of you know, mercury is a pollutant that can lead to neurological damage, in particular in unborn babies, where it can affect the developing brain and nervous system. And mercury also can have cardiovascular effects. Human activities have greatly increased the mercury pollution over the last 150 plus years, and that's mainly because of combustion of coal, mining, and industrial uses of mercury. And once mercury is emitted to the atmosphere, it's actually quite volatile, and that means it can be transported over long distances far away from the pollution sources. And one such area is the Arctic, that we know is impacted by mercury pollution. A very interesting specific cycling of mercury in the Arctic happens in polar spring along the coast when the sun comes up, a cycling that we call mercury depletion events. What basically happens is that mercury in the atmosphere gets converted to an oxidized reactive form that then can deposit quickly out of the atmosphere, therefore called depletion events. And we think that these atmospheric depletion events add dozens of tons of additional mercury input to the Arctic each year.
So in this study, we wanted to look at how changes in sea ice may affect these depletion events that Daniel talked about. Arctic sea ice is actually very dynamic and can experience features called sea ice leads. These leads are large cracks that open up as much as 10 kilometers wide and can be hundreds of kilometers long. When open, the underlying warmer seawater is exposed to the cold Arctic atmosphere, producing what are called ice lead clouds, which can be seen here and almost look like boiling water. These leads are very dynamic, opening and refreezing over large areas after just a few days. Leads are also more prevalent in what is called seasonal sea ice. This is sea ice that is produced each winter and melts each summer. Across the Arctic, larger and larger areas are experiencing seasonal sea ice rather than perennial sea ice, which is sea ice that does not melt each year. Seasonal sea ice is saltier and thinner than the perennial sea ice and more readily experiences leads. To study the potential impact of these dynamic sea ice features, we went to Barrow, Alaska in March and April of 2012 as part of a large field measurement campaign called the Bromine, Ozone, and Mercury Experiment, or BROMEX for short.
This was a joint study between the Desert Research Institute, Environment Canada, NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab, and colleagues from other institutions. In the following pictures, you see how we brought out our instruments on top of the Arctic Ocean with ski-doos and sleds. We then installed measurement equipment out on the sea ice, and these included measurements to characterize the atmospheric mercury chemistry, ozone, and other measurements such as wind speed and directions, turbulence, and gradients of these constituents above the snow.
Coupled with the measurements on the ground, our colleagues at JPL provided us daily satellite images that allowed us to determine when and where sea ice leads opened in the Arctic Ocean. An example of one of these satellite images is shown here. The blue colors are the completely unbroken sea ice, and the darkest areas are open leads. You can see this large lead in the middle that is opened up and actually stretches for hundreds of kilometers. These other lighter cracks that also look like leads are in fact leads that have newly refrozen and are covered by a very shallow ice layer. I'd like to point out that you can see a large-scale example of the lead cloud that is emitted from the water surface of the lead. Once we had these satellite images, we could overlay NOAA high-split model results that allowed us to estimate the path that the air followed and environment it encountered before it arrived at our measurement site in Barrow. These paths, called back trajectories, could be generated every hour and allowed us to actually see where the air had been. An example of this can be seen here. The colored lines show the air back trajectories for 7 different hours in a single day. You can see how for some times the air just barely touches the lead, like the green line, and for others, the air completely crosses over the open lead. We also have periods where the air trajectory was nowhere near an open lead, traveling over completely unbroken sea ice. We could do this modeling for every hour of the measurement campaign and compare that to our ground-based measurements of atmospheric mercury and ozone concentrations, which can be seen here. You'll notice that we have a very dynamic pattern of atmospheric mercury shown in red and ozone shown in blue. In particular, we have 3 times where the concentrations are depleted well below what we would consider global background concentrations, like the mechanism that Daniel explained earlier. These depleted periods we've labeled A, B, and C. We also have 3 areas where the atmospheric concentrations are near atmospheric background concentrations. These are labeled D, E, and F. The transition between depleted and the higher atmospheric background concentrations, like between box A and D, happens very quickly, sometimes within a few hours. We noticed that these transitions coincided with sea ice lead opening and refreezing. We then figured out that when the concentrations were depleted, like in boxes A, B, and C, the air had traveled completely over unbroken sea ice, like what is shown here in this yellow outlined box. Then when concentrations were near the atmospheric background, the air had traveled over an open lead, like what we see here in the black outlined box, which is the example I showed you a little earlier. So for every period in 2012, when the air traveled over unbroken sea ice, the atmospheric concentrations of mercury and ozone were depleted, and when the air traveled over an open lead, the concentrations were at what we call the atmospheric background. We even looked at the mercury and ozone data from our colleagues at Environment Canada for Barrow in 2009 and found 2 other periods with the same pattern of low concentrations over unbroken sea ice and higher concentrations when traveling over open leads.
So after we saw these immediate increases in mercury and ozone concentrations after air masses crossed the open sea ice lead, we thought quite a bit about the underlying mechanisms. One idea was that the open sea water completely stopped the depletion chemistry. But this didn't make that much sense because it happened so fast and because concentration didn't just stay the same but actually went up. A second idea was that mercury came off from the open water surface. But this wouldn't have made much sense for ozone. And then we would have expected that the concentrations were related to the size of the leads, which is not what we observed. So we had quite a little bit of an aha moment when we realized that the open sea ice leads caused mixing in the lower atmosphere, inducing shallow convection in the stable Arctic boundary layer. This mixing, in effect, mixed down air from higher in the atmosphere. And because these air masses were not depleted in mercury and ozone, it also brought down mercury and ozone from these higher air masses down to the surface.
Well, there are a couple of very important implications of the discovery in general. First, it may mean as the Arctic changes, with increasing seasonal sea ice and the number of sea ice leads, there may actually be more mercury deposition to snow and ice than we previously thought. Well, that could mean that there's more mercury that may move into these already fragile Arctic ecosystems and ultimately ending up in wildlife. And so what we want to do in the future is to determine exactly how this mechanism is impacting overall mercury deposition in the Arctic and how the mercury cycle may be changing as the Arctic changes. We also want to determine how this mechanism may impact other pollutants and how they cycle in the Arctic. Well, what this particular finding does is it makes us realize our understanding of environmental processes in the Arctic must change as the Arctic changes. And the linking of the physical and chemical processes that we've done here actually allows us a new way of looking at a phenomenon that we've known about for 20 plus years. And it makes us think about how there may be some unforeseen consequences as the Arctic changes. What's next is we would like to look at how this mechanism occurs across the entire Arctic and throughout the entire year. So stay tuned for more advances from our group here at DRI, and as always, for the most up-to-date information on our Mercury findings, you can here at DRI, you can always go to our website at www.dri.edu.